Thank you. Hello, hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the third episode of the Black Perspectives Live podcast series, a collaboration between Concordia's Black Perspectives Office, BPO, and Fourth Space. For those of you who signed up to this event last week and got the email to join us here today because of a last-minute cancellation, thank you so much for joining us. We're so pleased to have you here. For today's conversation, BPO's founding coordinator, Annick Maugile Flavien, is joined by the Simone de Beauvoir Institute program and outreach coordinator, Marlihan Lopez, in a discussion around the themes that led Marlihan to her work, her experiences as a Black feminist, the mobilizing work she does around supporting survivors of sexual violence in Montreal North, and the impact, she hopes to continue to shape at Concordia and beyond. So on behalf of Fourth Space, thank you both for joining us today. Annick and Marli, great to see you here. And thank you, audience members. I'll just note that this event is being recorded and will be available as a gently edited podcast wherever you get your podcasts. So we invite you to check out Fourth Space Concordia on Spotify, Apple, SoundCloud. This live event is currently live streaming at CU Fourth Space right now. We invite you to activate the chat with any comments that you might have throughout, any reflections that you might want to share. And if you have questions, please pop them in to the Q&A or raise your little hand emoji and you'll be unmuted and given the opportunity to speak towards the end of the conversation. On that note, welcome both. Over to you, Annick.
Hello, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here. I'm particularly excited for this this webinar because Marlihan is a sister from another mister. So quite excited to be engaging in this conversation with you and all of that. But before we get started, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University and Fourth Space is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Ganyegahaga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and water on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is a home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within Montreal community. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Black Perspectives Office is informed by and stands in solidarity with Black lives. We advocate for, support, and connect and champion Black perspectives at Concordia University, including Marlihan's perspective. And so I'm really excited to get into all of that. Marli, would you like to introduce yourself and kind of tell us a little bit about how you got to this particular role at Concordia, but also a little bit about your general parkour in life?
So good afternoon. Thank you so much, Annick, for inviting me. I will say I'm kind of nervous, like I said earlier, because Annick is a dear friend, sister, and it's the first interview I do where the person interviewing me knows me intimately. So I'm kind of nervous, but thank you for inviting me. And so to answer your question, I come from the community sector. I worked several years within the movement to end sexual violence for the Coalition of Rape Crisis Center here in Quebec. So I was in charge of coordinating the intersectionality and diversity division. I worked with women's groups and community organizations, organizing around prevention against sexual violence and issues concerning sexual violence, but that touch minority groups like Indigenous women, racialized women, LGBTQ communities, etc. So yeah, I come from community and I started working at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute roughly 2 years ago, next April, in charge of coordinating the new interdisciplinary studies and sexuality program. And I also had the mandate of coordinating events and also doing community outreach. So it's a new program and we're building it in coordination with Natalie Curry-Toe, who used to be the program director. And part of what we want to do is develop meaningful relationships with community orgs and value and highlight and showcase community-based knowledge because it's really important for the program. And so you want me to explain a little bit more about my life?
Yes, I want to hear all of it.
Oh, it could be hours here. Sometimes I feel like I'm 80 years old. So I was born in Puerto Rico. My father is a Black Cuban immigrant, and my mom's Puerto Rican, and we moved when I was 5 years old to the States. So I was raised in the Deep South, New Orleans, Florida, where I did my elementary school, part of middle school, and then when I was like about 13, my mom decided that it was time to leave the States, and we relocated again in Puerto Rico. So I did my high school undergraduate at the University of Puerto Rico, and I think that really shaped me because, well, two things shaped me. The fact that I was raised part of my life in the Deep South, I think that gave me a specific consciousness in terms of race politics, in terms of politics around migration. And so, yeah, before moving to the States, I think it was when I moved to the States that I realized, you know, that I was Black, because in Puerto Rico, like, I think discussions around race, they're starting now, but everybody just likes to say we're all Puerto Rican and try to not elaborate on racial dynamics within the island. So I remember moving to the States, I was confronted to the fact that, yeah, I was Latino, but I was Black. And I was, you know, before being Latino, I was Black. So I think that gave me a certain consciousness. I was also aware about decolonial politics because Puerto Rico was a colony. And so moving to the States and the treatment that Puerto Ricans had at that time and continue to have in the States, and the fact that most Americans don't even know that Puerto Rico is a colony. You know, I would get asked my green card. They didn't know that, you know, we're American citizens. And so that gave me an interest in learning more about Puerto Rico and about decolonial politics. And so I started getting involved when I was 15, 16 in separatist movements in Puerto Rico, and I continued that work in the university. And then later on, I decided to come do graduate studies in Quebec. And so I did a master's in Université de Montreal in international studies. And so in a past life, I wanted to work in international cooperation. And so when I finished that degree, I did a project in Cuba, and it was my first project in terms of international cooperation. And just that experience led me to understand that I did not want to continue doing that work. But it also, I think I began to feel that I needed to leave Canada and go back home and just work and just live back home. And so I ended up living a year in Venezuela because I was super interested in the Revolution Bolivariana. And so I began with my ex-partner. I began working in Venezuela. He used to be a ophthalmologist, and they were involved in a mission bringing healthcare to Venezuelans that don't have access to it. And so I began working with women that also were organizing around microcredits and programs that the revolution had developed to address gender equality. So after that, I moved to Cuba back home because I felt that I needed to have that experience and be with the family that I didn't know well. And so I lived with my grandmother, who was a activist and also a member of the Quebec Women, the Cuban Federation of Women. And so I think I got a lot of my politics from my grandmother, and also the interest in organizing in the women's movement. And so I spent 7 years in Cuba living. And then after Cuba, I came here. And I decided to continue working within the women's movement, and I was part of a women's collective called Fondation Parole de Femmes, which gave a platform for racialized women here in Quebec to express themselves around different issues. And after that, I started organizing with the Quebec Women's Federation, and now I'm vice president of the Quebec Women's Federation. So that's it.
I love it. I'm so happy that we took some time to kind of look at your overall parkour, because I think that one of the things that I've noticed a lot in kind of pop culture, or just, you know, like the society conversations these days, is you know, how much of activism and social justice is kind of centered around American narratives of what social justice looks like, as if other parts of the world have not had activist frameworks for many generations, or else we wouldn't be here. You know, like myself coming from you know, a Haitian like context where both of my parents were activists, and my father was like a political exile and all that. I think that I think that often we think we're reinventing the wheel, and we undervalue so many knowledges that come from many different parts of the world, and our grandmothers and our you know, like all of the people who have contributed to why we're able to think the way that we think, and rooting in that. I also wanted to think about, I know that you identify as a Black feminist, and I wanted to know if you could expand a little bit more on that, and what does Black feminism mean to you, and why do you say that when you present yourself?
So you just said something really important around how our experience shape our work. And I think it's important to say that, yeah, I identify as a Black feminist. And also, I've never taken a course on feminism or a women's studies course, which is it's kind of interesting, because a lot of the people that I've met or worked with that work, you know, within the women's movement come from these types of academic backgrounds where they have studied women's studies or feminisms, and I have never taken one course. And, you know, I always like to say that my feminism comes from my experiences, even though Black feminist scholars have shaped my work in terms of giving me the vocabulary to articulate and describe my experiences and other experiences that Black women have. So I guess I would say, yeah, that my work is informed by a history of Black queer women organizing in social movements that center Black queer folks. And I think it's important to say also that I don't talk about Black feminism as being one. For me, it's plural. I've met a lot of Black women that identify as Black feminists, and there's a large, it's a big plurality in terms of ideas. But I could say, it's really, for me, it's super difficult to define, but if I had to define it, I would just say that it's important to center how, as a Black woman, race, class, ability, sexual orientation, and gender identity, how all that influences our experiences as a Black woman, and especially class is like, and I think today within the women's movement, we don't talk enough about class, how class politics have an influence and impact women's advancement and gender equality.
Yeah, very much. I know that in general, like in all of your work, I know that you speak a lot about intersections, whether that be, you know, anti-Black racism, gender-based violence, police violence, class. I'm really inspired by that, and I feel that it's so necessary for us to think about those intersections, particularly in this pandemic, which has been you know, an interesting moment for a lot of these intersections to really, I guess, unfortunately, be highlighted in ways that were invisibilized before. How does that impact your work, whether that be, you know, at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute, or the work that you kind of engage with outside of the Institute?
The pandemic, you mean?
The intersections, like how do you kind of marry some of all of these areas? Because I know that, at least in my experience, I'm seeing a lot of silos. I'm seeing a lot of people wanting to work on one issue at a time and not realizing that it's kind of one and the same in a lot of ways. And though I understand the need to kind of highlight maybe certain communities or et cetera, I find it very limiting because, if we're looking at anti-Blackness and we're not looking at gender, then what are we really doing? And so I wanted to know how are you addressing that in your own work?
So I guess, like, I haven't had a choice. Like, I know that for a lot of people, it's difficult to understand that we have to address all intersections, and you can't separate race from gender and vice versa. But for me, it's been like, I have no choice. My experiences in life have made it that, and since I like, my work is informed by my experiences, it's just like, it plays out that way. In terms of as being a Black queer woman, I cannot organize if my organizing does not include those experiences, does not include Black folks with these experiences. And so I guess early in my work, in terms of organizing around feminist issues, I had a clear idea on how race, gender, sexual orientation, and like how they intersected. But one thing that, and also class, but one thing that was missing was ability. And so it was when I became a mother and became a mother of a Black autistic kid that I started seeing how ability also intersects with all these other systems of oppression. And so, once again, it wasn't through reading or study, it was through experiences, seeing my kid excluded and the experiences he was having in school, and not only in the institutions that we navigate, but also within organizing. And you know about this. You helped me write that article on my experiences in organizing and how ableism, plays out within social movements, and the fact that we don't even address it. And we think that, that's not something that happens. And so just to answer your question, for me, it's like, I haven't had a choice. It's my experiences have made it that, that for me, it's important to always center the margins and have these considerations when I organize.
And do you find that it's like, speaking of that article that you wrote, can you kind of speak a little bit to those challenges? I find that in organizing, whether that be in the community sector and the academic sector or the whatever policy making, et cetera, I encounter so many challenges of trying to bring the many intersections of my own personal life, whether that be caregiving or mothering or whatever it is. And I would love to hear a little bit more about the challenges that you experience in terms of being able to represent the many identities that you carry within your own intersection, but also the people that you want to center.
Yeah, it's difficult because we have a tendency within social movements to sometimes reproduce the same dynamics that we aim to abolish. And so whether it be organizing and anti-racist movements, we tend to center a certain group of people in our organizing. And so we don't acknowledge that within, for example, the Black community, there are other communities that are pushed to the margins. And I think it's difficult. We tend to center majority groups, whether it be within minority groups. So if it's in LGBT organizing, we're gonna center white LGBTQ folks. If it's within Black, Black liberation struggles, we usually center the experiences of Black male, cis het, people. So it's a tendency to always start center majority groups, even within minority groups. And that's like a big, it's a big challenge to raise awareness and also to convince folks that in centering the margins, you're not being divisive, because that's something I hear everywhere. Like whether it be in women's group, they're gonna say, oh, but the main struggle is patriarchy and we need to be united. We can't be divided by, addressing racism, by addressing colonialism, by addressing ableism. And when you're working with the Black liberation movements, you can hear the same type of comments like, oh, we can't divide ourselves as a community. We're all suffering racism. So why do we have to talk about other issues that affect our community, that affect minority groups in our communities? And so it's something that that I've seen in organizing with different social movements, and it's a challenge to work in understanding that by centering the margins, you're not being divisive. You're just ensuring that everyone is able to be free at the end.
Yeah, and I love the way that you frame it, like centering the margins, because I think that we've definitely seen it within Black community organizing. The systems that have been put in place by Black communities have benefited all, right? So whether that be like in terms of labor rights, in terms of, so many of these different movements that we've been central to have ended up being the kind of the prototype, the model, the frameworks in which other communities are using to get their sorts of justice. And it's really quite interesting to me that, again, like there's this fear of centering the margin or actually thinking about our minority groups when being able to think about them as kind of the framework from which we move out from, then actually creates a structure that is much more solid. Yeah, I also would love to talk, you talked a bit about mothering and just the different intersections of your life. And I wanted to know how has the pandemic impacted your work and also your life? And I know that especially in that beginning part of the pandemic, not that it's in any way kind of eased off, but I guess we're more used to it now, but the particularities of trying to maintain your responsibilities when the pandemic is hitting your family life in a very particular way.
Yeah, I was in survival mode, to be honest. It was really difficult because at the beginning of the pandemic, schools closed and they remained closed for almost 6 months. So I had to, work a full-time job plus another full-time job of being a mother because my kid was at home. And it was especially difficult because unfortunately there was no support from the schools because my kid was in a special ed class. And believe it or not, these classes were completely abandoned, while I had colleagues that their kids were doing Zoom classes, my kid had nothing. And so it was really hard the first 6 months of the pandemic. It was super hard. And at the beginning, it was like the isolation because I've never organized online. And so you have to learn new tools. And at the beginning, I was like, okay, everything's going to be are we not going to organize anymore while it's, the pandemic is happening? How is this going to work? And then, everybody started looking for our alternative ways of organizing, and George Floyd happened, and so the summertime was a very busy time in terms of organizing after George Floyd's death, also organizing in the context of sexual violence because there was a series of denunciations, and so it became once again another a big conversation in terms of media And so, yeah, so it was hard and it continues to be hard. And I think the hardest part is in terms of accessibility. And I like live that every day with my son, and the fact that, you know, how to navigate like institutions that were already difficult to navigate, but which now become even more difficult. So I guess that's like the major issue right now would be that.
Mm-hmm. I don't know for you, but I know that, you know, we talk about mothering a lot. And one of the things that I've been experiencing the most kind of viscerally is like this, you know, coming from a community that's like so heavily surveilled and so heavily policed, and to have like this like constant camera in our homes is like really, like I find it really intense in a lot of ways, and intense on two levels. On one level, because I feel like as a Black person, it feels very difficult to have to share so much of my home with communities that don't necessarily respect our home or understand our home or value it in any kind of way. And then on another level of, you know, with that access, I feel like there's even smaller moments of like commentary or engagement that feels so superficial. It's like, it almost makes the burden harder, you know? So you know, like single parenting, we both know how intense single parenting can be. And then to have like people comment on like, oh, how do you do it? And oh, this seems kind of crazy, and et cetera, et cetera. Like,
how do you do it question? Oh yeah.
Yeah, the constant, you know, how are you making it happen, or et cetera, you know, and also like I'm a caregiver for my parent and my mom, and that also, that this layer of kind of eyes on our lives in ways that we didn't necessarily consent to, because we didn't consent to the pandemic. We're just kind of making do, right? And having kind of this outsider perspective on it, which means that people can also comment on it, but then don't necessarily support more than to comment, right? It's just kind of like, oh, how do you do it, without ever feeling like there's anything that can be done. And I think that that's the biggest stick point I'm finding is in engaging with kind of anti-discriminatory, anti-racist work, and et cetera, is that often it's like people look at us, particularly when we're in positions where we're kind of doing the more visible justice work. People will kind of like, wow, amazing, you're doing so much, that's so great, et cetera. How can we help, without ever actually offering anything, which I think is like really counterintuitive for me, because, you know, like, I mean, I come from a community like, you don't go to somebody's house without bringing something. You don't have to ask them what you bring. You just show up with something, right? So it's like really, so I don't know if you've experienced it in that way, and how that's felt for you.
Yeah, I've experienced it, and the how do you do it, or oh my God, like the fake admiration type thing that, you know, when they compliment you, but then when you ask for help, you know, you see that there's not really a sense of a community. So in terms of how I deal with it, I have my, you know, my own community of, you know, friends that are family, like you. And so I, you know, it's counting on one another, because it's really isolating. It's really isolating. And I think, as an organizer, I could say I believe that organizers are sometimes some of the loneliest people out there, because I don't know, I think that a lot of times we're just seen as organizers, and our, you know, humanity sometimes is like not even considered, or the fact that besides being an organizer, you know, you're a mother, you're, you know. So yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel it. And I find it really hard to balance the kind of extra emotional labor. You know, we talk about the invisible labor, especially, you know, in academia, a lot of the talk around invisible labor is like the, you know, you supporting students who identify with you. And of course, that is a big part of it, right? It's like who comes to us, who needs us, like the kind of support that we give others. But I think another aspect that I'm finding quite difficult at this moment is the emotional labor of just seeing how much your life doesn't equate to other people's lives, and having, not only do they have a glimpse in yours, but you get to have a glimpse in theirs, and seeing their support networks happening like in real time. And it's really like, I find it kind of jarring, you know, like to be like, oh, wow, I can just like literally see it happening right now and know that that's like, look at the weight that you have to carry, and that there won't necessarily be some sort of relief to that on a day-to-day basis. So
yeah, like I think the main, like if we were to talk about a compounding effects of the pandemic, one of them is like really isolation. And I see a lot of people talk about isolation, and I don't know if people acknowledge that a lot of communities have been living in isolation even before the pandemic. For example, you know, if I talk about parents who have kids with disabilities, like if I talk about schools here in Quebec that have classes, special ed classes, a lot of times, like in my experiences, these classes, I've never seen a white Quebecois kid in a special ed class in a public school. And that was, you know, I'm not saying that there aren't, I'm just saying in my experience, they've all been, especially like specifically newly arrived immigrants, and mostly Black and brown. And so, and a lot of times they don't speak the language. And so I remember meeting parents, like Latin American parents that don't speak French, and having to, you know, trying to help out to see if they can communicate with the teachers. And, you know, there's a lot of South Asian parents that don't speak French. And like just witnessing the isolation that these parents like navigate in, and in terms of not having the tools to advocate for their kids who are, you know, facing so many barriers, and it's really hard. And, you know, I've been watching this since I arrived. I arrived in Quebec. I came back in 2015 with a kid, and I've seen how, you know, like the isolation. And so, and there's so many other communities that have been living in precarious conditions and in isolation. And now with the pandemic, it's even worse. But now everybody's talking about like the isolating factor. And it's like, well, you know, this has been happening, this was happening even before the pandemic for so many communities, and we failed to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Or address it.
Yeah, and this idea of who gets to belong and participate in community, and or just in society in general. And I feel like so much of you know, the discourse right now is just like, oh, you know, it's our right to be able to participate. It's our right to, you know, it's our right has been taken away. And I'm like, well, that's so interesting. Oh, so interesting that now we're realizing that participating and being able to have access to full access to participate in society is such a crucial need for all, you know. When, I don't know about you, but for me, when I face a lot of these, I think that's kind of my understanding of ways in which Black women have been able to survive from generation to generation, is that we, you know, like you talked about earlier, take our experiences and find ways to kind of re-energize them and use them for the good of our like communities, and so helping our communities and supporting our communities. And I really loved what you touched on in terms of how organizers can be so dehumanized in a lot of ways, and dehumanized, I think, on both ends, right? Because I think that when we end up taking an organizer role, we get a bit put on a pedestal by the communities that we're helping, and then we're also kind of seen as like, you know, I don't know, maybe untouchable by from allying communities, and that's like really difficult. But But in a lot of ways, I also find that it's the only way for me to move forward, is to kind of find a way to reuse that energy and to bring it into my work. And I was wondering if what aspects of your current experiences are showing up in your work at Concordia.
So I just looked at a question from the attendees. So I kind of got, it's a really, really good question. But so you're saying how do my experiences inform what?
Inform kind of the work that you do at Concordia right now.
So I coordinate the sexuality studies program, but like I said, I'm also in charge of doing community outreach. And I think the fact that I've organized with different communities and that I come from the community sector, that like informs a lot of my work and the way I do my work. Because for example, coming from community sector, I know that a lot of times the relationships that academia has with the community sector are highly extractive. And so when I was hired at Concordia, at the Institute, I knew that I did not want to replicate or reproduce those types of relationships because I was like on the other side, you know? Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's important to take time and build relationships and see which ways we could, you know, collaborate, but always taking into account the power dynamics that exist, you know, between community and academia, and the ways that traditionally and historically academia has extracted and co-opted a lot of knowledge that comes from community and lived experiences of different communities. So for me, that's like super important, and that's what informs the community outreach part of my work.
Mm. And what, I know that there's quite a few projects that you're kind of invested in, but I know that the work in Montreal North is kind of the highlight of what you're doing these days. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
In terms of community outreach, yeah, it's the main project right now. So like I said, I used to work for the Quebec Coalition of Rape Crisis Centers. And when I worked there, I would receive a lot of calls from Montreal North, specifically from the CLSC, from social workers wanting to refer patients to rape crisis centers that had lived experience of sexual violence. And when I would tell them that, for example, for patients coming from, you know, women coming from Montreal North, the closest rape crisis center that was, you know, that didn't have a waiting list was in Hochelaga, Maisonneuve. It was like, what? Like my patient can't go to Hochelaga, Maisonneuve, it's too far away, transportation barriers, for those who haven't been to Montreal North, unfortunately, you know, local government has never, STM has never invested in the transportation infrastructure in Montreal North. It's, you know, it's an isolated community. And so I started, you know, that told me that, you know, there needed to be work done. So I started doing outreach, contacting community partners in Montreal North to see if there was any possibility of working to demand that there be a sexual assault resource center in Montreal North. And so it was, you know, it was very difficult because there's a lot of politics around this, believe it or not. And also the fact that a lot of rape crisis centers are like working in austerity with austerity measures. There's a competition on, you know, if money comes in, where it's gonna go. And unfortunately, Black and racialized communities are not a priority. So, so I started organizing with Narges Mustafa from Hoodstock and Gabrielle Garbeau, Hassine. We started organizing to see if, meeting with community orgs, meeting with rape crisis centers to see if we could push the government to invest in a resource center in Montreal North. And so we came to a lot of dead ends. The mainstream organizations that address sexual violence were not interested in helping us. They did not want to share their tools either. And so after a brief pause where I left my mandate and my position at the Quebec Coalition of Rape Crisis Centers, I then went to work at Concordia, and during the summer with the second wave of, like another wave of survivors of sexual violence sharing their experience, we also participated in a lot of media talking about the fact that in Montreal North, survivors are still waiting for resources. And so we had meetings with local authority and officials, and we decided to continue working on this project. And that's when the Office of Community Engagement at Concordia, Andrea, contacted me to see if I would be interested in working on a project, a collaboration between a community org in Montreal North and the Office of Community Engagement. And so I reached out to Narges Mustafa at Hoodstock, and we started working again, and it's going very well. There's a group of organizers from Hoodstock led by Narges, and there's a research agent that's working. We're finishing an action plan, which we're going to present to local government, provincial government, to ask for permanent funding. And we've already been approached by potential funders, private funders for the project. So it's very promising, and we're very, very, very happy and excited about it.
That's so amazing. I'm so happy about that. Yeah, I think it's such necessary work, and I really appreciate you kind of sharing that timeline, because I think that there's this misunderstanding often that when certain things are not in place, that there was like no will to make it happen, or that et cetera, and without acknowledgement of the many barriers, challenges, hardships that kind of lead to these openings and moments that happened. And yeah, and I'm really glad to kind of learn more about that process. In this specific work, I'd love to know more about, we're gonna open up the question and answer period in a few minutes. So if there's anyone who wants to put some questions in the Q&A box, but I guess as a closing question to this work that you're doing, I'd love to know if there's any particular kind of frameworks that you're putting in place, considering that, in Montreal North, we're talking about a very racialized community, an isolated community, and that obviously won't look like the way that we would have a resource center for different communities. And so what are some of the considerations that you guys are putting in place?
So cultural securitization, that's one of the main frameworks that we're putting in place after working many years in the movement to end sexual violence and working with rape crisis centers. Time and time again, year after year, we would see that a lot of communities did not feel safe going to mainstream rape crisis centers because their approach was not safe in terms of considering how racism, how transphobia, how many other systems of oppression informed their experiences as survivors. And so for me, it was important, considering the population in Montreal North, for it to be a community-led project. That's why, Hoodstock is working with different community orgs in Montreal North. It's a community project. And also, it's informed by people who live there. Because a lot of times, unfortunately, when we talk about community orgs and people who work in community orgs in certain communities, a lot of times they don't come from these communities and they don't have knowledge on, the issues that affect, these communities. And so in Montreal North, unfortunately, a lot of community orgs are very, very white, and which is kind of difficult to understand when you have a population that is majority, highly racialized. And so for us, it was important that that cultural securitization be a major framework, and that we ensure that the services that we do push forward or develop, taking into account the needs of the population of Montreal North, and also the people who work, when a resource center opens, the people who work there are representative of the population that lives there. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, in terms of prevention, because one of the major objectives is to tackle sexual violence with prevention in schools, is we're building a prevention program, that's going to be by and for. I've worked on a lot of prevention plans in terms of, the ones that are developed in mainstream rape crisis centers. And a lot of times they address sexual violence in a very stigmatizing way for our communities. Like culture, our heritage, our culture is seen as a problem factor, seen as a reason for. And so we're trying to deconstruct all this and build a prevention program that empowers our youth. And so, we can address sexual violence and the fact that it is a taboo in a lot of our communities, but through empowering ways, whether it be through the arts. So we have a lot of ideas in terms of ways in which we can address sexual violence that empower youth, and not stigmatize them, and where they can play an active role also. That's what we're working on also this year.
Amazing. That's so great. I'm going to open up the question and answer box. So if there was anyone who wanted to add some more questions, and I'm going to read that question that you read, that was so great. So someone asked, how have you been able to bypass paper credentialing and have others recognize your lived receipts? What do you suggest for others? So often in wider professional settings, those papers, quote unquote, degrees, et cetera, are what determine whether your profile is even considered.
So I have to say, I am privileged in the sense that I do have I have a master's degree. So I do have I have a degree from here. So I know the barriers that a lot of immigrant folks face. They can have PhDs. It doesn't matter. Here in Quebec, they only take into account studies that that you do here, and which is BS. But anyways, I am privileged in the fact that I do have a degree that I completed here, and that helps. But it's not in women's studies. It's not in basically, I did not work. I didn't do any professional work in terms of my degree. It's just a degree that has helped me, that has opened doors. So in order to, how did I navigate? I guess a lot of times I would put my, in my CV, I had no, I would put my lived experience, I would frame my lived experience as professional experience. And I would frame it in a way that it would, it would be, I considered it to be professional experience. And a lot of times it would be a lot of organizing that I did, and it wasn't necessarily paid, and that opened doors to interviews, and then afterwards to my first job here in Canada. And so I think when I was the first job that I had here in Quebec, I was given that job because I was very active in community organizing around gender equality and around intersectional feminism. And so I think, the organization that gave me the job, my first job here, was looking, for someone, and they were looking for also their first, Black woman, because, the organization didn't have a history of including this women's organization didn't have a history of including Black women in terms of their workforce. And so, little by little, with a lot of, the work that I do in terms of community organizing, it got respected as, credentials, professional credentials. So I don't know if I have a specific recommendation on how to do it, but like I've always told people, especially like migrant women who are having difficulties entering the workforce, or to like highlight, platform, and give the importance, the importance and merits to their experiences, even if they're not what we call professional experiences. So I guess that's part of how I was able to, but like I said, again, I am privileged in the fact that I do have a degree from a university here.
Yeah, I have a similar, I also have a master's from this institution. So I think that's one thing that I would maybe add to that for that question is also just kind of who you know and how you work that network as well. I know that within academia, there is kind of been a bit of a pushback in terms of changing what we consider relevant experience, especially with faculty members, and like, is publishing XYZ articles really relevant to the type of work that you want to do? And so there's like pushback on academic sense in that way, but then also I think my personal experiences, whether that be in community or inside of academia, has always been partly because either I was approached by people who knew of some of the work that I was doing, or because I approached people very much in the sense of, kind of, walk the talk that you that you talk, in the sense that, you can't say that you're trying to help racialized communities and people that don't necessarily have the credentials, and et cetera, but then when push comes to shove, you're not actually hiring them, you're not actually engaging with them, you're not creating opportunities for them, writing them their letter of recommendation, or whatever it is, that the support that people need. And so I think that's really making people accountable of that, especially the organizations and the institutions that are claiming that that's the kind of work that they're trying to move towards, is so key. I see that there's another question. Let me see. Oh, the famous question.
Lord. Okay.
The question is, any ideas on the N-word? I think if you want to answer it, you're more than welcome to answer it. Also, if you don't want to, that's totally cool. I think that I have organized several events this week, and this question shows up every single time. And so I think that people are either very interested or trying to instigate something, one or the other, however you want to appreciate it.
I would just say that academic freedom cannot be built on the oppression of Black students. And I don't see any circumstance that's acceptable, considering the history here in Quebec, and the present context, where we have a government that refuses to address systemic racism, refuses to even acknowledge the existence of systemic racism, where you have a education system that is completely whitewashed and censored, and the fact that we don't even address how slavery and colonialism has impacted Quebec society and continue to play out today. In that context, no, I don't believe any professor in any academic context should be using the N-word. So for me, it's easy, and I'm not gonna even dance around it, or, I think it's extremely, extremely offensive that in the present context that especially in the present context that we're living, that we're still having this conversation or debate, and that we're acting like students. We're not acknowledging power dynamics, and we're not acknowledging the fact that, in academia, students do not have that type of power. We're talking about oppression of academics. No. We need to acknowledge that not long ago, maybe 100 years ago, Black students were excluded from universities, were excluded from programs in university. So, so it's not like today, all these dynamics and, racial tensions and racial violence have just left university and academia. They're still present and we need to address them.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what I would have to say.
I love that you're wearing your Black Lives Matter sweater.
Yeah, I'm wearing it because I didn't have a t-shirt that said, "Do not use the N-word."
And I think it's so key because I think, one of the things that I find kind of interesting about this debate, and I'm not particularly interested in kind of like unpacking it right now because it's so heavily the work that I have to do on a day-to-day. So I'm not really gonna touch too much on it, but I will say that, for many people who have been in support of Black Lives Matter and who have been kind of thinking about, the ways in which systemic racism affects Black communities, who have been thinking about the ways in which we're murdered, oppressed, dismissed, undervalued, et cetera, it is mind-boggling to me that these same people would have a narrative where our experiences, and when we say that we are harmed, and when we say that we don't want something, and when we say that this is affecting us, like that still is considered debatable, that it's theorized, trivialized, all of the above, like that is above me. And so, so I guess that I would counter that question with a question of why is it that anytime that Black communities say that we can't breathe, the question is whether if that's actually true. So that's how I feel about that. To finish this wonderful conversation, I'm so happy that you're here. I have a question about how do you recharge your batteries?
How do I recharge my batteries? So community, real community. So I've told you before, Annick, like most of my closest friends do not come from like the activist scene. Like most of my closest friends are people who are like family. And so I know when to check out. Like I do the work that I believe in, but I also ensure that I do remember that I'm not just Marlihan, the Afro-feminist, Marlihan, the organizer. I'm also like Marlihan, who's very foolish and who likes to joke and, likes to party and, And so I surround myself by people who like treat me as Marlihan and like acknowledge that I'm not just an organizer and that that's not the most important part of, who I am. And also a lot of therapy. I have a brilliant Black therapist. And so, yeah, I'm privileged to have one and that helps a lot.
Yeah, I think you are brilliant. And I also know you mad silly. So keeping that balance. I guess we'll finish off. I know we have one more minute officially, but there's another question that I really like, kind of in the same vein. So someone said, you both mentioned the how do you do it effect. And how do you find balance between self-preservation, also wanting to stand in your power and just say, hell yeah, I do it. I do it because I have to, because I'm more powerful than you think. But then how do you evolve falling prey to feeling that we have to be quote unquote strong Black women?
So I guess also I forgot to mention, my kid keeps me very grounded also. Like I have no choice. It's like I have to take care of myself. And also like my kid, he doesn't care what I do.
They don't have any shit. This kid just showed up.
He doesn't care at all. Like he never, sometimes he trolls me. Like you've seen him troll me, but like he's not there for it, So he keeps me grounded. And then, like I said, the closest people that I have around me, they don't really care if tomorrow I stop organizing, and they're there because they know who Marlihan is beyond the organizer. And so, yeah, that's how it's like, you have to be careful who you surround yourself with. And also know that, like, also when you're organizing, you can't fall into a trap where you find yourself becoming indispensable to a struggle. You know, there's so many people that I've met throughout the years, and I continue to meet, that are brilliant and that contribute behind the scenes. We never see them, they're never on media. And so, like, I always try to discipline myself to not let ego play a big role in my work or in organizing, and understand that, you know, maybe tomorrow I won't be doing this work anymore, but also ensure that I create conditions and my behavior opens doors for other folks to continue the struggle if I can't tomorrow.
Yeah, 100%. I echo that feeling so much. In a few conversations ago, somebody was asking me a similar question, and I 100% agree. It's just like, I want to be as disposable as possible while still sitting in my powers, acknowledging the work that I do, knowing that it's important. But it's like, you know, ideally, if I should be replaceable, you know what I mean? Like, ideally somebody would be able to take the work on, and that's only really possible if we leave behind structures that make that possible. And that's what I'm really more interested in. And I 100% agree. My kid keeps me mad humble. And nobody is not interested in the work that I do. He tells me that I'm on the computer too much. Like, there's just no respect for any of this, as well as my mom too. You know, it's like it's actually quite interesting working from home right now, because I think on both spectrums, both sides of the age spectrum, neither of them understand that when I'm on the computer all day that I'm working. For them, it's an illusion. So it keeps you humble and just kind of grounds me in other ways. And dancing, I think for me is really, dancing really keeps me kind of alive in other ways, and just, yeah.
I need to pick up a physical activity too, because I'm not a good dancer, but.
Yes, you are.
I'm not compared to you.
You're too much.
I'm a good dancer until I saw you. So, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Marlihan, for being here with us. It is always so great to hear from, you know, all the work that you do, the brilliant mind that you have. I find that you are so grounded in your experiences, and really one of the most intentional organizers I've met in my whole life. You know, like, I feel like so much of what I encounter are kind of contradictions in people. And I feel like you face your contradictions before you even step out the door. And that really shows in the work that you do. And I'm just amazed by you.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor coming. It's special coming from you, because I admire you too. And yeah, thank you for inviting me. And I hope we can continue working together.
For sure. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us today.
Thanks, everybody. I hate to bust in here because I really wanted this to keep going. I was like, don't look at the clock. It's okay. But yeah, I realize the time has come for us to say goodbye. So thank you so much for your time, Annick and Marlihan, for sharing your ideas with us and for this engaged conversation. We had a great time listening to you, and we'll have a great time editing this conversation ever so gently and releasing it back into the world once again as a podcast very soon. So this was the third episode in the Black Perspectives Live at Concordia podcast, presented in collaboration with Fourspace and the BPO. Thanks for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you again for the next episodes in March. You can follow us at CU Fourspace or concordia.ca/4 to get all the details. On that note, happy Friday, and we'll see you soon. Bye. Bye.
Hey, I have to ask a question. So do I stay or do I call you?
We'll close the webinar now, so you'll get a good call.
$1,000 phone.
You want me to do phone? Sorry, keep it original.
Bye.